The Federal Reserve just announced they're rolling out the FedNow program in 2023. This tells us that central bank digital currencies are happening. The question is, are you prepared? I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over why they're going to happen, in my opinion, and how it's going to work from a technical standpoint. And before we go any further, guys, got to apologize about the glasses. And this temporary format had eye surgery. So while I'm recovering from the surgery, we got to do it this new format. And just as a service to all of you watching, I'm going to wear these sunglasses. Okay, let's get into the video. First and foremost, I want to point out that the Australian bank, or an Australian bank, and I know this is a small bank that doesn't account for that many transactions and deposits, but I think this is a good sign of where society, where the West at large is headed. They've just announced that they are only going to extend loans, car loans, to people who are buying an electric vehicle. So if you want to buy that Ford Mustang, you're SOL. You want to buy that F-250 or whatever, forget about it. So what this shows us, in my opinion, is society is moving closer and closer and closer to demanding banks extend credit not based on merit or not based on what consumers want or what businesses need to provide more goods and services, but strictly based on a narrative. And further evidence I would give you is just my research assistant, Josh. Just the other day, he took a buddy of his to college for the first day, and he found out that they weren't allowing white students to enroll that day. This was reserved for people of color, or whatever they're calling minority groups. They have so many names for them, I lose track. But the bottom line is, if colleges are going to this extent, and if they're teaching this to young people today, that there are disadvantaged groups and there are marginalized groups, why in the future wouldn't society, these young people, when they get out of school, demand that the banks extend credit? Again, not based on merit, whether or not you can pay back the loan, but simply based on the color of your skin, or simply based on how disadvantaged you are, or, in other words, based on narrative. So my whole point here is, a lot of us that value freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism believe that a central bank digital currency is going to be forced upon us. But I believe there's a strong possibility that society demands a central bank digital currency, just like many in society demanded that the government lock us in a cage during the cerveza sickness in 2020. This is just another reason why I think the probabilities of a central bank digital currency coming to fruition in the future is so incredibly high. So that's the why. Now let's get into the how this would actually work. To extend credit based on narrative and not merit, you would have to have a bank extending the credit, or at least backing up the loans, that didn't have to worry about a P&L. In other words, they had an infinite balance sheet. And you hear this about the Federal Reserve or other central banks all the time, that they have an infinite balance sheet. And they've proven that over and over and over again. What I mean by that is, central banks in the past have used their balance sheet in ways other than strictly a profit motive. Examples would be when they're buying corporate debt in March of 2020. They're just trying to prop up the market. They're buying it at any price. They don't care if they take a haircut on that corporate debt. Quantitative easing. They've said that they'll go ahead and they're trying to lower interest rates. They're trying to manipulate the market. They don't care about the interest rate. They don't care about the price they're paying for that treasury or for that mortgage-backed security relative to the rate of inflation. They're indiscriminate buyers. So again, this proves the fact that they have an infinite balance sheet and they're willing to extend credit without worrying about being paid back. So how do they do this? from a technical standpoint. I know a lot of us know that the Fed's balance sheet is infinite. They can do whatever they want. But very few of us understand technically and mechanically why this is true. And it's very important you understand this for the rest of the video. So let's go to the whiteboard, and we see the Fed's balance sheet. We've got assets on the left, liabilities on the right. And then we've got bank A, B, and C. We've got their balance sheet below the little green boxes. You can see my artistic ability is absolutely phenomenal. But let's just assume for a moment that Bank A needs to transfer $100 to Bank C. Okay, well, the Fed's balance sheet, the liability side, is going to have the deposit accounts for all three of these banks. And let's remember that those liabilities of the Fed are assets of the individual banks themselves. And you see that with the red square with the BR for bank reserves. So if Bank A is transferring $100 to Bank C, well, they would just let the Fed know to execute the transaction, and the Fed would subtract $100 from Bank A's account, and they would go ahead and add $100 to Bank C's account. No big deal, right? So the main takeaway here, and what I want you to notice, is there's been no transfer, or there's nothing happening on the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet. The only thing that's happening is just a reduction and an addition on the liability side of their balance sheet. Right, now let's go down to the second example where we've got the average Joe transferring $100 to everyone's favorite, Moody the Millennial, and their blue hair. So Moody was doing maybe some DoorDash for Joe. So Joe owes them $100. So what Joe would do is he would go to his bank. Let's say he banks with Bank A, and Moody banks with Bank B. And he would say, okay, bank, I need you to transfer the $100 to Moody's account through Zelle or something like that. So let's remember that Joe's account is a liability of Bank A. So when Bank A transfers the $100 to Bank B, they're transferring Bank B a $100 liability. Well, they can't just transfer the liability. So what would happen is they would also need to transfer a $100 asset to Bank B. So you see what makes this different from the first example is when banks are transferring liabilities from one bank to another, this affects the asset side of their balance sheet. But when the Fed transfers liabilities from one bank to another, it doesn't affect the asset side of their balance sheet. Therefore, technically, they don't even have to have assets because all they're doing is keeping score, right? Where the commercial banks, in order to be a bank and to serve their customers, knowing that they're going to have to transfer liabilities, they have to have assets. So a bank can go bust. But this is why the Federal Reserve, because they're just one bank for all the other banks, this is why they cannot go bust. So it leads us to an interesting thought experiment where you could say, okay, well, if there was just one commercial bank, let's just say the only bank we had in the United States was Wells Fargo, could they go bust? I think the answer is no. Because no transaction that would occur would ever affect the asset side of their balance sheet. They become just like the Federal Reserve, where they're just transferring liabilities from one account to the other. This, from a technical standpoint, is why a central bank's balance sheet is basically infinite and why they could extend credit based on narrative and not merit. Step number 2, the Federal Reserve's FedNow system is coming in 2023. They have already announced this publicly. So how does it work What does this mean? And how will it take us one step closer, a huge step closer, to having a central bank digital currency? Let's dive into it right now. But before we get into the whiteboard, let's actually go to one of the Federal Reserve's YouTube channels and hear it directly from them. Editor, let's cut to the internet.
In today's fast-paced world, time is money. More people, businesses, and organizations are demanding instant payments. That's why the Federal Reserve is developing the FedNow service, a safe and efficient instant payments infrastructure that will modernize the U.S. payment system. The FedNow service will give financial institutions the opportunity to innovate, enabling their customers to send and receive money in seconds, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Funds will settle between financial institutions in real time, which means there's no buildup of interbank obligations, and end users will have access to the funds in seconds. How will the FedNow service work? Imagine the owner of a coffee shop is running low on coffee beans and needs to schedule a quick delivery. She places an order, and the coffee bean company sends her a request for payment. She responds to the request for payment and pays for the coffee beans right then and there through an app from her credit union, which uses the FedNow service. Once she initiates the payment, her credit union screens the payment and sends an ISO 20022 compliant payment message, either directly or through a service provider to the FedNow service over the Federal Reserve's FedLine network. The FedNow service instantly validates the payment message and passes it along to the coffee bean supplier's bank. In real time, the supplier's bank confirms to the FedNow service that it intends to accept the payment, and the FedNow service debits and credits the master accounts of both the shop owners and the coffee bean supplier's financial institutions or the master accounts of their correspondents. The FedNow service also immediately sends a payment message with an advice of credit to the supplier's bank and notifies the shop owner's credit union that settlement is complete. Finally, the supplier's bank credits the supplier's account in near real time, making the funds available. The supplier's bank will have the option of sending a confirmation to the shop owner's credit union that the payment has been posted to the supplier's account, providing the coffee shop owner with certainty that the payment was received.
So hopefully you noticed in that clip how they talked about the banks settling with their master accounts they have with the Fed. This is what we were talking about in step number 1. And in my opinion, when they roll out a central bank digital currency, this will mean the average Joe and Jane, the businesses, the private entities in the real economy will have a master account with the Fed. And this is how the Fed will extend the credit by just simply creating bank reserves out of thin air, just like they do now. And the entities in the real economy will be able to spend those bank reserves directly to buy goods and services. Dr. Lacey Hunt calls this turning bank reserves into legal tender. Let's dive into technically how the system works right now. So we've got Bank A and Bank B. Let's assume these were the same banks that we were talking about with Joe and Moody in step number 1. And they want to transfer funds from one account to the other. Maybe they want to transfer funds between customer accounts or maybe between their own accounts that they have with each other's bank. They call these correspondent banking arrangements. So that would just mean that we'll say Wells Fargo and Bank of America. Wells Fargo has an account with B of A, and B of A has an account with Wells Fargo. And so going back to step number 1, we were talking about transferring liabilities. Let's say a customer liability, $100 from Joe's account at Bank A to Moody's account at Bank B, and that's a liability. What could happen in that situation is the $100 liability going from Bank A to Bank B, and then Bank A saying, okay, Bank B, instead of me transferring you an asset, why don't you go ahead and just reduce my account balance that I have with you. This is Bank A talking to Bank B, or Bank of America, whatever, Wells talking to Wells Fargo, or vice versa. Go ahead and reduce my account balance by $100 to make up for the $100 liability that I am sending you from my customer paying one of your customers. So again, by Bank B adding $100 to the balance of Moody, that's creating an additional $100 liability. Therefore, they would either need to receive a $100 asset from Bank A, or they would need to reduce Bank A's account that they have with Bank B by that same $100, so everything nets out. This would be an example of a correspondent banking relationship, and this exists everywhere, internationally, domestically, around the world today, the Eurodollar system, the domestic banking system, you name it. So now, what if these banks don't have a relationship with one another? Or what if there's just so many transactions going back throughout the day that there's just no way to possibly keep track of all of them? Then you go through a clearinghouse or a net settlement situation or a net settlement entity that you kind of put them in the middle. I'm just using clearinghouse as an example. So this would be CHIPS. I'm sure you've heard Jeff Snyder talk about that. And what CHIPS stands for is Clearing House Interbank Payment System. So all these bankers and financial types, they love their abbreviations and their acronyms. But CHIPS is no joke. Just to give an example, right now they're clearing about $1.8 trillion per day, going back and forth from banks domestically and internationally. To my knowledge, they work exclusively with dollar transactions. Now, CHAPS would be a UK version of CHIPS, just to give an example. Now, there are other entities that work by using net settlements. This would be PayPal. I believe Zelle works this way, Visa, and ACH, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with those types of payments. So what happens is, let's say there's $1 billion worth of transactions going back and forth between A and B every single day. So going back and forth between Chase and Wells Fargo, or Wells Fargo and Chase, or B of A and Wells Fargo, vice versa. And instead of actually clearing every single one of these transactions, they all go into the clearinghouse, or maybe this entity that does these net settlements. And what they do is they kind of just tally up a score. And at the end of the day, they go ahead and say, okay, well, after all the billions of dollars have gone back and forth, basically Bank A, you owe Bank B $1,000. They just do the transaction for $1,000. This would be an example of an entity that was used for efficiency and cost effectiveness that uses these net settlements. So, editor, go ahead and switch out the whiteboard to the whiteboard that shows what FedNow actually does in this current system. Boom, there you go. As you can see, pretty simple. Basically, now the Fed does everything. So instead of using one of a clearinghouse or a net settlement entity, the Fed just inserts themselves and says, nope, we'll go ahead and handle that. So SWIFT, no need for you. CHIPS, no need for you. PayPal, Zelle, no. Jerome Powell will handle that moving forward. So to be clear, this isn't a central bank digital currency in and of itself. This is just simply the infrastructure to implement a central bank digital currency. Now, I know a lot of people push back, a lot of people in FinTwit and whatnot, and say, well, the Fed will never get into a central bank digital currency because they don't want to deal directly with the retail customer, with the average Joe and Jane. And okay, that may be true, but I think the way the model will most likely work is you've got the average Joe and Moody, we'll use them as an example again, and currently they've got an account with Bank A and Bank B, but then what Bank A and what Bank B does, they don't go out of business, they just simply transfer that deposit liability to the Fed's balance sheet. And maybe the Fed reduces their bank reserves by an equivalent amount. Now, would Bank A or Bank B get upset? Would this hurt their business? No. This would be a windfall for them because right now, customers are just simply an unneeded expense for the retail banks. They're absolutely flushed with bank reserves. So they don't need customers at all. They don't need your deposit. This is why they're not paying you any interest, even though the Fed is increasing interest rates. And this is why they treat you like a redheaded stepchild, because they don't want your business. Now, the pushback there might be, well, George, they need to implement these loans, and this is how they're making money. Okay, fine. Well, what the Fed can do is they can go ahead and just pay the bank fees for the loans that they create. So the Fed wouldn't have to get involved directly with the public. The Fed could just say, hey, Wells Fargo, you need to start lending to this disadvantaged group. And Wells Fargo says, great. We just did $1 billion worth of loans. And the Fed says, okay, fine, we'll go ahead and buy those loans from you. We'll pay you a fee, like a finder's fee. And then what we'll do is those loans will go onto our balance sheet that is infinite. And it's basically what they're doing right now with mortgages. It's pretty much the same. The big commercial banks are the originators of the loans, but they have sold that loan to Fannie and Freddie before the ink is dry on the contract. So why wouldn't it work the exact same way, but instead of selling to Fannie and Freddie, the banks are just simply receiving a fee to give or sell those loans to the Federal Reserve? I mean, if you think about quantitative easing, the Fed is buying the mortgage-backed securities regardless right now, or they have in the past with QE. So the loans are ending up on the Fed's balance sheet regardless. So implementing a central bank digital currency really wouldn't change the way the system works right now from the standpoint of the Fed and or the big commercial banks. And then the banks can continue on just with all of their, on the whiteboard I've got financial activities, but we know that means financial shenanigans. So they can continue financializing the economy by creating derivatives and doing high-frequency trading and all of these things. And they don't have to deal with customers other than just originating these loans that they offload to the Federal Reserve and receive a fee. From a commercial bank's standpoint, offloading their liabilities to the Fed in order to implement a central bank digital currency would be a dream come true. So the main takeaway from step number 2, that although FedNow isn't necessarily a central bank digital currency, it is the infrastructure to allow the Federal Reserve to implement a CBDC in the future. And even the mainstream media is insinuating that a true central bank digital currency is the next step for the Federal Reserve. Editor, let's cut to the internet. This is an article from Yahoo Finance talking about FedNow, and they say the FedNow system would help the government transmit emergency relief payments to Americans faster, avoiding making citizens wait for checks as during the pandemic. So in order for you, the average Joe and Jane, to receive money directly into their account from the Federal Reserve, they would have to have a master account with the Fed. And if they have a master account with the Fed, by definition, that is a central bank digital currency. They're turning bank reserves into legal tender. Step number 3. So how do you not only survive, but hopefully thrive in this world of out-of-control central banks, big governments, and central bank digital currencies? Well, I think the best advice I can give you is to go through a quick thought experiment with me. Now, this may sound funny, but I'm actually being quite serious. So, as you can tell on the whiteboard, I've got a picture of the United States, obviously. And down in the lower left corner, we've got the grand, wonderful, incredible state of California. So what I want you to do right now, assuming you don't live in California, and also assuming that you're someone who values freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism, let's just assume that I forced you to live or move to California right now. What would you do? I mean, I've asked myself this exact same question. So why is this relevant to what the future may lead to in a world of central bank digital currencies? Because when we're talking about extending credit based on narrative instead of merit, we're talking about a wild misallocation of resources and malinvestment. And this is exactly what's happening in California. And what started happening, I mean, let's call it decades ago, but we're seeing it really come to fruition. And in my opinion, California is getting exponentially worse, and their policies are becoming exponentially more insane. Therefore, they're misallocating exponentially more resources. And we see what the net effect is playing out right in front of our eyes. So assuming we go into a world of central bank digital currencies, or even just domestically here in the United States, I think that California is a preview of what will happen to the entire domestic economy. So if we think about what's happening in California right now, they're literally warning people about blackouts. They're encouraging them to use less and less energy. Pretty much what we saw in Germany maybe just a few months ago, or in the UK, where now we have seen their electricity bills explode higher. And I know as an American, it's tough to get your head around this, but I did a video on this topic just yesterday on the Rebel Capitalist channel. And there are some people and some entities, some businesses in the UK that have seen their electricity and utility bill go up by 250%. In some cases, even more. So think about what you would do if you knew you were moving to a state that most likely would have blackouts, a lack of energy, and or utility bills that were, let's just say, 10 times higher than what you were paying right now. What would you do? Also, let's talk about high rates of inflation. If we're getting just limitless credit creation, in other words, money printing, and we're misallocating resources, we've got the exact same environment that we've seen over the past 2 years. In other words, demand up, supply down. So what happens to prices? They skyrocket. It doesn't take a genius to figure this out. So if you were moving to a state where it was obvious consumer prices would continue to increase by, let's say, 20% per year, what would you do? And if you were moving to a state that was in rapid deterioration, now some may argue that it's not that rapid. Well, yeah, maybe if you're a millionaire living in San Diego or something, or in Malibu, but go in LA, and as an example, I'll use a story that I just tweeted about just this morning. Editor, let's go ahead and pull up my Twitter feed. In Los Angeles right now, as we speak, they're trying to compel hotels to house homeless people with 100% of their occupancy or vacancy. So, and I'm not making this up. This is, you can Google it. And I need to give a big shout out to my good buddy Peter Schiff. I originally heard this story on his podcast. But my point is, think about the resources. Just this one example is going to misallocate, assuming that this goes through. And this is just one of thousands examples that I could give you in the state of California. And if we go into an environment with a central bank digital currency, you will see this happening, not just in California, but throughout the United States to a far greater degree than we are seeing it right now play out in the wonderful state of California. So going back to the whiteboard, let's think this through. If you were living in a state that was taking these types of actions or implementing these types of policies, what would you want to do? Well, I know what I would do. I would be as self-sufficient as possible. And we know how this works. You guys know I'm great friends with Dr. Chris Martenson, and Lynette Zhang. They talk about this all the time, being as self-sufficient as you can with food and energy. Now, I know a lot of people, this isn't realistic, but I think what is realistic for everyone watching this video right now is to have some of your purchasing power outside of the banking system, whether that's with Bitcoin, whether that's gold, silver, I don't care what it is, but have something out of the banking system and try to build your life starting right now in a way in which you do not need credit. Now, you can use credit, that's great, but you don't need credit to survive. A lot of people that may be watching this video right now, they have to have credit just to get by. They have to have that credit card. They have to have that mortgage to buy the house. They have to have that auto loan to buy XYZ car. And if that's you, I would suggest, and if you're worried about a central bank digital currency, I would suggest taking steps right now to try to build a life that doesn't require credit. Again, I'm not saying don't use it, but don't be dependent upon it. Because in the future, I can't guarantee you that you're going to be able to get that credit regardless of what your credit score is. You may have the wrong color of skin. You may be the wrong gender. You may have the wrong views toward the government, personal freedom, the woke movement, you name it. And therefore, why should we give you credit? This is the central planners talking. And if they don't, and if it's not happening through the commercial banking system, if there's no profit motive, then again, they can extend or not extend credit to whomever they like. So build your life now in a way to where you don't need them. You're completely self-sufficient, or as self-sufficient as possible. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I'll see you on the next video.